Well, welcome to our next podcast. I'm with Dilan De Silva, the author of the book Profitable Hotels and Motels, a street smart formula. Now, Dylan, I want to talk to you about a really fascinating chapter in your book, and it's about the structure, or should we say, the four essential pillars to success. And you say that these pillars will determine the success, failure, expansion, or destruction for small to medium-sized accommodation business. I found this quite fascinating because when I think of pillars, I think of the Romans,
Right.
and
Right.
their buildings were, littered. A bad term. They had pillars, beautiful pillars, and those pillars are still standing today. The strength of those pillars was critical to the Roman building process, and I think from reading your book that the four pillars you've created are essential and will last for many, many years as the key to surviving and profiting from hotel management ownership. So your four pillars, and I'm just going to introduce it and I'm going to ask you to talk to us about it in detail.
Sure.
The four pillars are, first pillar, number of rooms. The second pillar is occupancy. The third pillar is the average room rate. And the final pillar is your operational expenses. So, shall we talk about the number of rooms to start with?
Sure. I'll step back a wee bit here.
Please.
When I was writing the book, I was trying to figure out. There was two reasons for me to write or put everything into these four pillars. Number one is, the Christchurch earthquakes. I was managing a couple of hotels there, and after the earthquakes, I understood that some of the buildings that stood the test of the earthquakes were square buildings, and square buildings, they moved, they settled. Maybe one side went tilted a little bit, but they stayed.
Do you mean as opposed to buildings that were on slabs?
Buildings as opposed to buildings with various shapes.
Okay.
The square buildings,
Right, gotcha.
because of their four pillars, kind of stood strong. So hey,
When one moved, the other stayed, and so on and so forth, or they balanced each other out.
they didn't collapse.
Correct.
They balanced each other out. So that was one. Then I was thinking, oh, wow, this is a good philosophy, or good example, good narration. And then the second thing got me thinking is, okay, hey, in my career as a hotel manager, there are some things I did wrong. Obviously, in some properties my occupancy wasn't right. Some properties something else wasn't right. So I boiled this down to four. And I understood that if these four were managed well, it applies to any property. It could work with a 10-room hotel. It could work with a 100-room hotel to a 300, 400-room hotel. It's a principle of playing the balance game in a tourism accommodation business. So that's how these pillars actually came into being. And I see them as four. Some people could see them as more, but in my opinion, there's four key pillars. And like a building, if these four pillars are strong, it'll hold it. If one pillar is weak, the building could crumble down. That's my opinion. So, as you mentioned in that chapter, the four pillars are the number of rooms, the occupancy, the average daily rate or the average room rate, and the cost of operations. So, shall we talk about the first one?
Yes, let's talk about the number of rooms.
Number of rooms. So, see, when you're buying a property or when you're in a property, it's more or less a fixed principle. The chances of the number of rooms changing is not that much. You might have one added room or you might do two chalets, but in general, it's a fixed principle.
So what you're saying is that basically you're buying, let's say, a 10-room motel. That's fixed. Nothing changes. Without an exceptional amount of money on the side, you're not going to add 10 more rooms because we probably won't have enough land space to do that, either the cash or a whole lot of other factors, building approvals. There's a whole lot of things about expanding a property that may not work. So you've got to base the purchase, if you like, on the fixed number of rooms that you've got and work within that confine.
Definitely. So the number of rooms would result in the other three pillars, because it's a fixed principle, there's nothing much you can do.
Right.
You would understand the logic of a 10-room property business to a 20-room property business. Now, there's a saying when you go to buy properties, or when I was selling properties, there's a saying that if it's 8, 10, 12 rooms, it's good for a couple. There's another saying that if it's 15, 18 rooms, you can have additional housekeeping staff and still make some money. If it's 25 rooms, it's a good model. If it's around 30, 40 rooms, you can even afford to have a manager. So understanding this principle is really important when you're buying or running a business. Whatever you might do, a 5-room hotel, unless it's a boutique hotel, or you run it in
B&B.
Bali or
Yeah.
B&B, you might have to do it by yourself. So
Yeah.
this is why I say understanding the number of rooms is very important, because once you understand the number of rooms, you can understand the other derivations or the other pillars of it. And the number of rooms would have something to do with capital if you're an investor or if you're buying into a business.
Yeah.
And if you're managing a property, it'll kind of determine how much can you be paid as a manager. You can't pay $100,000.
And I guess how much work you're going to have to do as well.
Exactly. So again, the number of rooms would explain to you, whether it can be a operational based manager or whether it can be a hands-off or hands-on operation. So I think that's one real important pillar for you to understand, based on the amount of money you have and based on how much involvement you want to have in the property. For example, if you don't want to get involved in operating or managing this property, buying an 8-room property as a passive investment is not going to work, Owen.
I get it.
The reasons behind is that for 8 rooms and the revenue you'd make out of those 8 rooms, you can't really afford to have a manager if you're running this property in the US, if you're running this property in Europe, if you're running this property in Australia, or if you're running this property in New Zealand. Maybe in a place like Bali or Fiji, this could be a bit different because the labor cost is cheaper. So you must apply the number of rooms, that principle, based on where you are looking at operating the business.
Would the number of rooms, would that also relate to the business available to you as well? I mean, for example, if you've got a small motel in a small town that doesn't get a lot of tourists, does that relate to, say, having a bigger property in a small town where it may be a lot harder to fill the property?
That's correct too. So it'll come back to return on investment. If your property is in a particular city which does not have that amount of occupancy to be geared for a larger property, then yes, it'll come back to that return on investment principle.
So in other words, it touches on that supply and demand situation in terms of the number of rooms that are relevant to its position.
That's correct. So some use this term in the tourism industry. I built a white elephant. So that's the answer. Where it's a very Asian term, white elephant. It is that it's an expensive elephant, but it can't do much for you other than moving a few
And
blocks.
we know people that have built large properties in out of the way destinations that have never been fulfilled in terms of success or profit, because there just aren't enough people going to that town to accommodate the property. And the other thing I notice is that some people who are buying bigger properties believe they can attract people to the town or to the destination, and that's a very tough task.
It's a big effort. It takes a big effort to do that.
Individuals can't promote destinations. It's just too big a task.
Agree. And it takes a lot of money, in experiment to try and do that and get that working. And that's a great question, I would say, or great point is, the example I made at the beginning. If your one pillar is not right, it will crumble down. So if you've got a big property and you have less demand for that property, you're going to crumble down, because running and maintaining that property is going to cost a lot of money. So there you go. That's
not counting the capital to buy it.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I understand that, and I've seen a few examples of people that believed it's an interesting philosophy here. Some people believe that their motel in itself or their hotel in itself is the attraction.
Yes.
Yet, you know, from the other side of the coin, people use hotels and motels as a convenience as much as, or more so, not so much, as the reason.
True.
You know, why do you go to a destination? Do you go there because of the property or the motel you're going to stay at? Not normally.
Yep. True.
It's like an airline. Hotels and motels are a byproduct of the destination attraction.
Fully agree.
And you've got to understand that. Otherwise, you think you can bring people to your property because they love your property and they want to stay on your property. That applies in some cases to wellness resorts and that sort of thing, but not in many cases.
Not in many cases. So, the number of rooms, in a destination, if you have the number of rooms, and if you're trying to sell a destination market, or if you're trying to sell something unique like a, Ayurvedic resort or something like that, maybe that'll add value, but it has to be taken with a lot of salt and pepper, I would say, just to make sure that it's a viable business. So that's the first pillar. I would say, if you're buying a property or if you're in a property, understand whether you are running the business to suit the number of rooms. Because if you don't, then your pillar could go out of balance.
Yeah, and again, the demand for that destination where your property is relevant to the number of rooms.
Definitely.
Otherwise, you would got to compete with the other properties in that same destination.
Definitely, fully agree. So, in summary of point number one, I would say a few things to look at is that it's a fixed principle. I missed it there. Start again. So, a few things to look at as we discussed is the supply and demand to that destination, and how many rooms do you have, and based on that number of rooms, what's your engagement? Do you want to operate as a passive business, or do you want to operate it as a business you are engaged in operations, or hands-on or hands-off? And the other thing is, can you fill the rooms? If you can fill the rooms, how much will it cost? For example, it's pointless having a 100-room hotel where your occupancy is only 20%. What are you going to do with the other rooms, and how much is it going to cost for you to maintain the other rooms?
Gotcha. So, okay, I think that explains the number of rooms. Pillar one.
Yep.
Let's talk about the next subject, which you've just about touched on, and that's the occupancy of those rooms. So, give us a bit of an insight into occupancy, which is, from my thinking, massive.
It is massive. A few things to consider here is whether your property is a seasonal property, or whether your property is a transient or a city property where you would have a reasonable occupancy throughout the year. So from what I've seen in my career running city hotels and resorts, is that resorts would have a high level of seasonality. In Asia, you would base it on the rainy season and the dry season. In New Zealand, Australia, some parts of Europe, some parts of the US, you would base it on whether you're a ski resort or a summer resort. So here it matters. In my opinion, if your year-to-date occupancy runs below 40-45% without having the right room rate, which you're going to talk next, you're in a bit of trouble, because you are. What I have seen in properties is that if you're around the 40-45%, you're kind of sitting on the fence. It's very fragile.
Can I interrupt a minute? So a lot of resorts close for the off season. They're open for the ski season or the summer season or the festive season, whichever it may be. Then they just close it down.
Yep.
Because they can't afford to maintain the property, which is what you're talking about.
Yes.
With a 5% or 10% occupancy rate. Just doesn't work.
That doesn't
so
work.
They just close it down. And I wonder whether those places can make a profit, even though they're still paying for half of the year when the property's closed. They're still paying bills, they're still paying rates and insurance and maintenance and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, good example. My brother-in-law worked in an island in Sicily. He was a chef, and he was saying it only opens 5 months of the year, and it's shut for the rest of it. So yes, the 5 months does make money, but then the next pillar, which is what we're going to talk next, the average room rate really matters.
Yeah.
So if you're opening 5 months a year, a resort 5 months a year, you need to have a good number of rooms and a very, very good average room rate.
And a very good occupancy.
And a fantastic occupancy, because the council is not going to lower your rates just because you're going to shut down.
Or the insurance company.
Exactly. They might charge you more for the time you're closed because of security and things like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that the occupancy matters. So if you're buying a seasonal resort, you need to ensure that your year-to-date occupancy, not the month occupancy, but if you look at 365 days, it sits at a good percentage around, probably, I would say 60 is just about break even. You're really not gonna make a lot of money, even though you have a high average room rate. You're really not gonna make a lot of money at 60. So just to add to that, Owen, I was consulting to a client who's based in Florida, and he was gonna buy a property in Venezuela. And this destination is seasonal, highly seasonal. They have good occupancy. They don't shut it down, but they have good occupancy 6 months of the year, and average or poor occupancy 6 months of the year. And his numbers stacked up to the average occupancy when we looked at over 5 years. It was sitting around 48-52%. So in my opinion, I told him, hey, this could be the wrong investment. Because at 50% occupancy, can you really make money? I mean, why are you buying the property? Is it for a lifestyle reason, or are you trying to make profits out of it? I mean, if it's for a lifestyle reason, if family's going to have some holidays there, that's all right. You can just pay your bills there. But if you're really trying to make money, that's the wrong number. So occupancy is a very important pillar. And now, for example, let's look at the Gold Coast in Australia. The average city occupancy sits around 93%.
Yes, that's amazing, isn't it?
That's amazing, right? So the chances of you making money are much higher. So a good average for a property based on where you are would be, sitting around the 70s, 80%. And in my experience, if you're sitting around the 60% occupancies year to date, you're still not making that amount of money.
Nevertheless, if you've got 93% occupancy, the cost of the property is going to skyrocket, isn't it?
That's correct. So that's the reason for the other two pillars.
Yes.
They'll all work in integration. The second pillar is good, the occupancy. You need to have it right in comparison to the cost of operating the business and the average room rate.
Yeah, right.
That's kind of my opinion.
Bring us to the next issue, the average room rate.
I
like the fact that you're talking 60% plus is kind of critical.
Yep.
That makes sense to me. So you might be 100% for 6 months, and I don't know, is it 40% for the off season, and that's the average is out 65 or 70%, whatever it is. That's okay.
That's okay. Yep.
Right. Okay. So we've got our occupancy discussed.
Yep.
Now talk to us about the average room rate.